unlocking your world of creativity with best-selling author and brand innovator, Mark Stinson. This episode is brought to you by White Cloud Coffee Roasters, where every bean tells a story of adventure. Visit whitecloudcoffee.com and use the code CREATIVITY.
Welcome back, friends, to our podcast, Your World of Creativity. And on today's show, we're going to talk about the genre of historical fiction and a great new book. But we'll also be talking about the journey of the author herself, from a clinical psychologist to a novelist, and all with a journey like that. I'm so happy to be joined by Leslie Schover. Leslie, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Her new book is called Fission, a Novel of Atomic Heartbreak, and it's set during the Manhattan Project in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. It explores, I'm looking here, love, ambition, secrecy, identity, and moral conflict. Wow, it's got it all.
Female friendships, too.
And female friendships, and really how the world was being reshaped during that period scientifically, but I love the emotional aspects too. Let's start with the inspiration. Fission was rooted in stories that your parents told you about life during those times and places. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, I wasn't born until 1952, but my parents married very young, just before Pearl Harbor. My mother was 19 and my dad was 22, and a incompetent gynecologist told my mother she couldn't have children, so they neglected to use precautions, and she immediately got pregnant and had to drop out of college. And that was my older sister. So when my older sister was still a toddler, my dad, who only had a year of technical school, was recruited at the University of Chicago to be an electronics whiz kind of guy for a chemistry group in the Manhattan Project. They were responsible for creating the first gram of plutonium, and they needed instruments to measure this new radioactivity stuff.
So fascinating. And when did you realize that these kind of personal family memories could become a novel? How did you begin to think about weaving the stories and creating the arc of this book?
I always loved the stories, which I'm sure my parents told many times during my childhood. And during the later years of my dad's life, he lived to be 87. He gave talks for senior citizen groups about his Manhattan Project experience. But I think he died in 2007, and I had wanted to record him on video, and he died too suddenly for that to happen. So I kept thinking about it, and in around 2019, the New York Times published an article about a Soviet spy who operated undetected at Oak Ridge and was an electronics engineer like my dad and worked in the same building as my dad. And then another similar spy was uncovered, and a distinguished nonfiction author, Anne Hagedorn, wrote a whole book about him, Sleeper Agent, and published that in 2021. And he was also an electronics engineer, worked in the nuclear reactor building, and all three of them, my dad and the two spies, came from really similar family backgrounds, Eastern European immigrant Jewish families, except my dad wasn't a communist. That really got me curious, and I realized there was no way I would ever find out if my parents knew either of these guys. And I was busy with my career, and I finally retired almost all the way in around 2021, and I had some time to go back to my early love of fiction writing, and I'd taken lots of creative writing in college and then did a lot of nonfiction writing in my career. So I started a different novel, and then it occurred to me that this would be a great topic for a novel, and that I wanted to know more about my mother. She and I were close as children, and then we were somewhat more estranged by the time I got to be in college. And I never knew what it was like to be a 19-year-old at that time with a new sickly baby, thrust into this pressure cooker of an environment in Oak Ridge. And I thought, wow, I want to really explore that and try to understand her point of view.
Yes. And the title Fission certainly works on all these levels that you're talking about, scientific, emotional relationships. How did you think about the parallel, the splitting of the atom and the fractures that happen in relationships? What were your angles there?
Early in the novel, there's a scene where my parents are both told about the atomic bomb by my father's group leader who was recruiting him. And that's based on a real life story they always told. But in the fictionalized account of it, I have Doris, the heroine, say, Fission, isn't that like breaking the atom's heart? And so that was a metaphor that I used several times in the book about her being torn apart by her relationships.
Let's talk a little more about Doris. Doris Friedman is the complex lead character, young mother, frustrated artist, a woman navigating the times, certainly in the 40s. What drew you to tell the story through her eyes?
As I said, I thought about all the differences between my life and my mother's life, how my parents had worked so hard and climbed up from fairly poverty-stricken or working-class immigrant backgrounds to give me a really pretty privileged life in a affluent Chicago suburb, and I got to go to college wherever I wanted and go to graduate school and not worry about student debt and all those things. And I thought how different it was for my mother, who graduated college at age 16 and was offered to go to Wellesley by her wealthy uncle, the one wealthy relative. And she was too scared to go, so she went to the University of Chicago and then had to drop out before she could graduate because of her pregnancy. So I wanted to, and I know how frustrated my mother was all her life. My parents were both very self-taught people. My dad had a year of technical school and had a successful career as an engineer. And my mother had no accounting degree and managed to be the first controller of a industrial company in the state of Illinois who was a woman. And they were very determined and very smart and very driven. And I wanted to go back to what that young person must have been like and how she had to toughen up and take care of her family.
You're really touching on several things I wanted to drill down on a little bit, and that is the expectations, gender and otherwise, marriage, ambition didn't always go together. And you really explore a lot of that in this book.
And also, Doris and Rob come from somewhat different social class backgrounds. Doris's family has more of a middle class pretension to education, and Rob's family is pretty solidly working class. So Doris is always pushing Rob to go back to college and get his degree, and he's always telling her, this college stuff isn't necessary. I can learn everything on my own. And I think that was something, maybe not as quite as much of a theme as I've portrayed it, but definitely something that was a difference in my parents that I witnessed myself.
Yeah. In addition to your parents and your own experience, I think about your work as the clinical psychologist, decades of studying and hearing about relationships and identity under stress. And again, through the decades, how that must have changed. What did you see, and how did that background of your work help inform or influence your fiction writing?
I had a kind of an odd specialty as a psychologist. I was super specialized because I spent a lot of my career at MD Anderson, the big cancer center in Houston. And my special area of research and program development was helping people with their sex lives and fertility after they'd had cancer treatment, which often damages those things. So I think, but I did a lot of couples work over the years, and I think just my knowledge of couple dynamics and how people's sexual desires and needs for intimacy come into their relationships probably informed some of my writing in the novel.
And certainly we're living in a world where there is this secrecy. Some people are feeling fear, the relationships under pressure. Again, what do you think we can learn from the experiences told about in the book? But it's like, how can we bring those Manhattan Project, relationship experiences to the current times?
Well, I think one thing I'm struck by is how easy it is for us to forget. This year was the 80th anniversary of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, so there were more thoughtful programs and stuff on it than there maybe usually are. But I think we forget. People tend to think about the horrors of nuclear war, which I totally agree with, and I'm all for nuclear disarmament. But I talked to my father growing up about why he was working on that project, and he always pointed out to me that they felt compelled to work on the atomic bomb because they thought the Nazis were working on it at the same time, and that with a bomb like that, you could win the war. And so they didn't see it as much of a choice until after Germany surrendered and Japan was on its knees. And then my father, along with a number of other scientists, signed a petition to Truman asking him not to just use the bomb on a human population, but to demonstrate it first and see if they could get Japan to surrender. And that petition, I don't think, ever reached Truman, and there were so many people by then determined to use the bomb that it was like chasing windmills. But I think what we can learn is, number one, what our country can do when we put our minds to it and have a moral cause. And the other is the need to have morals in using our power. And that's certainly a lesson that I don't see being taken very seriously today. So I'm
Well,
pretty
we can wax a little philosophically here, but I was just reflecting the other day how somebody born today is further away from 9/11 than even when I was born, from Pearl Harbor. And did Pearl Harbor affect my life like 9/11 did? Whatever you would say. But you're talking about our sort of historical memory and lessons learned from these historical memories. We've got a lot to stay current with, don't we?
Yeah, we do. I've gotten a little bit peripherally involved with the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and so I've been working on this book, and they have some great programs on not only the risk of nuclear war, they're the people that do the doomsday clock, but also on the risks of climate change and other potential world catastrophes. And it's very frightening to think about how many dangers there are in the world right now.
So thinking about a reader who turns the last page and closes the back cover of Fission, your book, how would you like them to be reflecting on that scientific progress and yet ethical dilemmas of risk?
I think just to be thoughtful. I don't think there's any one way to reflect on things. But also, I think another thing that is maybe part of the book that I worry that we're losing is the respect for science and what science can achieve. And there's a large part of our population today that distrusts science and doesn't believe in the scientific method or scientific evidence. And that's something that certainly has been a foundation of my life and my career. It makes me terribly sad to see that.
Well, we could have a whole episode and conversation just on that, couldn't we?
Yes.
Leslie, what a terrific conversation. I want to talk a little bit about your creative journey, but before we get too far, let people know where to find you and connect with you and your work.
I have an author website. It's really simple to find. It's just leslieschoverauthor.com. And there's a place on it to order Fission and to sign up for my Substack, which is a kind of behind the book explanation of some of my parents' real stories and how they related to the book. So that would probably be the easiest way to find me.
Fantastic. I'll put those links in the show notes for sure. As somebody who then moved to fiction after this long career in psychology and healthcare and working with cancer patients, as you said, what would you say to our creative listeners who might be saying, I had another career. It might be too late for me to return to my creative calling. What would you say to them?
I would say nonsense, because one thing I've discovered as I've started writing fiction and developed networks of fellow writers is there are just tons of people who retire from their careers and finally have the time to write and are turning out some really great books. It, and it is easier than ever to get a book published, but to get your book noticed and bought is not so easy.
Yes. And you mentioned that networks and support and groups and so forth. How have those helped you?
One of the first things I did when I decided to try writing fiction again was I took a workshop, and it had two leaders. One was a literary agent and one was an author. And we met in Provence, France, I was lucky to be able to go
Wonderful.
to that. And there were like 10 people in our workshop, and two of them have become my online author critique group. And so we meet every couple of weeks and read each other's work and give each other tips and support. So that's been extremely helpful. And also the mentorship we got in the course and from our course leaders. And then I joined the Women's Fiction Writers Association, which is not really just for women authors, but for people who are writing so-called women's fiction, which is basically fiction where the woman is a central character. And they have a historical fiction group that's very active and has an online meeting every week. And I've gotten involved in that and helped volunteer to be part of its infrastructure. And in starting my author newsletter on Substack, I've met other authors on Substacks. And my publisher, She Writes Press, has a practice of trying to help their authors help each other through Facebook groups and online seminars and things like that, which a lot of traditional publishers don't do. And She Writes is what they call a hybrid publisher, which means that the author commits to subsidizing the publishing costs of the book and then gets a much higher royalty rate than you would with a traditional publisher. But even though they're distributed by Simon & Schuster, it's a lot harder to sell your books in bookstores, and you have to really do your own publicity or hire a publicist to get your book marketed. So, it's got its pluses and minuses for sure. It's very difficult for older authors to get agents. It's very difficult for anybody to get an agent.
Right.
But I think a lot of agents, which I understand because they're working on commission, want a nice young author with a big social media following who will publish lots more books and get them more money. And
There you go.
And,
But it
and
sounds
it's been-
like you've really taken advantage of a lot of these resources.
Yeah.
First of all, my compliments, but thanks for sharing all those ideas. I think we could all, let's rewind the tape and make a list of everything that you've done there. It's really excellent. Thanks so much, Leslie. My guest has been Leslie Schover, clinical psychologist turned novelist. She's the author of a great new book, Fission, a novel of atomic heartbreak. Well, Leslie, thanks again for being on the show.
And thanks for having me as your guest.
You bet. And listeners, come back again. We continue these round-the-world conversations with creative practitioners. I love talking with authors and singer-songwriters, hospitality professionals, architects, radio commentators, all sorts of creative expression being had out there. And there's so much for us to learn, not only about the tools and techniques, but also just about the mindset of making an impact with our creative work. And that's what it's all about. And before we go, I'd like to offer you a free download of my ebook called A World of Creativity. Just visit my website, mark-stinson.com. And thanks to our sponsor, White Cloud Coffee Roasters, you can enjoy a 10% discount when you use the code CREATIVITY at checkout. So until next time, I'm Mark Stinson, and we'll keep unlocking your world of creativity.